That works. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to give people a couple minutes to kind of sign up or get online. Regardless, either way, this is going to be on YouTube for the future, and then, yeah, we'll get from there. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to need to build up a YouTube following there. Hmm. Oh, I might as well just share my screen here. What am I doing? All right, there we go. Actually, in the meantime, let me see how that if it's on YouTube right now. Okay, so it is working. Perfect. Sounds good. Give them their 2 minutes, and then we'll see what happens. Yeah, so today's topic is actually we're going to be talking about ADUs, garden suites, conversions, laneways, and some of the requirements how the city interprets a few things. At least from my experience, again, everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different. But from my current projects I'm working on, things I've submitted in the last couple months, and then things recently approved, both in the Toronto and Hamilton area, the idea is basically educating people on like what's going on with these ADUs and what's possible, right? Um, yeah, and then what's actually required. Specific areas, like we'll talk about a little bit more, but in Hamilton, if you don't go over a certain square meters, you don't really need topographic survey. Where in Toronto, it's like you're going to need it. So there are different cities have different requirements. So that seems to be the complications when you're trying to do ADUs in different cities. So we're going to try kind of help some of the investors understand it from at least a Hamilton, Toronto perspectives. I know some other cities may have different points of views, but we'll get there when we start doing more projects in those areas. But yeah, so basically tonight's just letting people know the technical side of things. Yeah, yeah, it's a pain in the ass. It's not as expensive as it was back then. In the past, we used to get them for like 4,000. Now we're able to get them for like 2,000, give or take. But it's still a bit of time. Like now, instead of like being at 12 weeks, we're looking at 3 weeks. So it's not it's still some time consuming there. Yeah, we're even if I could do that with my machine, we're going to need like an engineer to stamp it off, which most engineers will not stamp it off just because of their own liability, situation there, right? But I'm interested. Yeah, if we could do that, it would make the job a lot easier because the machine I have does pick up on grading points, so we know every word that goes like up and down and such. So it does pick up on that. It's just trying to get an engineer to be comfortable, stamping off on that grading points there. But it doesn't pick up on like sea level, so we don't know how high that grade level is above sea level. So that's another situation there. But okay. Civil or structural? It's more civil, I would believe. Yeah, civil engineer would do that. Delta structural engineers would do so. Okay, so we'll get started. I know some people were texting me about trying to give them a little bit more time until 8:15, 8:20, but they can catch up a little bit later. So we're going to start with Hamilton, and this is one of our right now example projects where we have an existing bungalow. We have an existing bungalow that we're making into a triplex, and then on the back side, as you can see on the screen here, we are proposing a two-story ADU. Now, depending on the city that you're working with, a lot of cities have restrictions. And so far, a lot of cities I've seen in the past, Cambridge, Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara, they're all like the 6 meter maximum height, which when you convert that into feet, we're looking into like, okay, do you want to go over ADU high level first? Like, did you have any specific questions on that? I'm going based on like, people already have a good understanding of the ADU. Right. Okay. So we're gonna start there. Perfect. Okay. Um, So accessory dwelling units. Some cities have different interpretation of how they say that or how that terminology. Accessory dwelling unit is really just another unit. But when we're talking about mostly like garden suites, they have different names. Coach houses, garden suites, laneway houses, ADU detach in Hamilton or secondary unit detach again in Hamilton's older bylaws. Right, they're basically a separate building on the same lot as your primary building and are designed to be a lot smaller than the main building, right? You can't really have a garden suite ADU to be bigger than like the primary original house that's there. So the idea is it's supposed to be accommodating for another sort of unit on the property that's separate. Some people were telling me that some of the ADUs they could do, they wanted to have like a house addition, which keep in mind there is a minimum distance between the two. So if it's attached to the original house, it's no longer an ADU detached or a garden suite. It's more of a house addition. So don't get that confused. But yeah, garden suites are pretty much a smaller version of the house and designed and meant to be, its own primary unit. And as a rule of thumb, and I know this is a very common question when we're talking about garden suites ADUs, how many units you can have in them. Majority of the cities I've been talking to, if not all of them, are saying one unit in these garden suites ADUs. So keep in mind that if you want to do one, it's usually going to be one unit in each of these garden suites. Now, just as an overview, I know we're going a little over a minute, but there are some cities that do allow two garden suites depending on how much land you have. Like Innisfil, they would allow two garden suites if you have a certain number of land. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's like 1 acre or something. I have to double check that. But there are situations, and in this project example that we're going to get into, that we're designing an ADU to be 2 stories and have like either a basement or a ground floor level that has its own storage space that is going to be ready to be built to be like the fifth unit on this property for future proofing, basically. Right. So even if you only have one unit today, it does not stop you from doing an extra basement level or an extra second floor level to have that additional unit in the future. Because now what we're seeing is a lot of cities are trying to push into more density into these low density and mid density areas. So in the future, even though right now it's like 4 or 5 units, the city could push in for more units. So if you're going to be doing a garden suite anyways, and you're going to be designing it to have 2 stories anyways, you might as well design it in a way to have that additional unit in the next 3 5 years from now. So yeah, that's pretty much the high overview of garden suites there. And again, that's just for people who aren't too familiar with that. But now we'll get a little bit more technical here. So we're going to start with Hamilton, and then we'll lead into Toronto. So back to the project we're working on right now. This specific project, we're doing a 2 story detached, garden suite. We are a fairly deep lot. So for those guys, for those realtors and agents who are looking for lots, this one is about 50 feet wide by 177 deep. That's how deep this lot is. Normally we're looking at 120 or so, but this is 177. So we have a large amount of backyard space to put like an ADU. And in our case, we're putting 800 square foot ADU here, garden suite. And the idea here was to have the ground floor level going to be like a storage, service, and even a parking, area. And the second story above this area is going to be the unit itself. So this is where you have to be very creative in your design, because a lot of cities will tell you your maximum gross floor area, which is, your livable area, has to be 800 square feet. Well, if you read their bylaws, a lot of times their livable area does not include storage, mechanical, utility, or garages. So this is where we kind of, use that in our favor here, where we're making the ground floor area to be its own, storage room, whatever, service room for now, but designing in a way where we can have all the plumbing, all the HVAC properly placed in that ground floor, where we can have that fifth unit on this lot in the future. So that's pretty much the high level here on the site plan. We're going to go a little bit more on the floor plan area. I know some people are trying to understand a little bit more, and of course, 2D drawings are a little bit hard to kind of understand for some people. So I want to try to break this down as easily as I can, right? So this area here where I'm highlighting right now is the, carport area. And so we have two ways to get into this ADU. One way is near the back side to go up the stairs to the actual ADU itself. And then we have a front door at the front side of the ADU to go into this proposed service room storage area, which roughly, when you take out the stair area for the upper unit, we have about 700 square feet in this whole space. And right now it's only being dedicated for the service room and any additional storage. But from what you can see here, we've already added the windows, we already added the doors, we're already fire separating the service room here. We're already kind of future-proofing it in a way it's going to make it easier for the conversion at a later date. Okay, so some people are typing, but give them a minute while I take a drink here. Okay, we're going to go to the second floor right now. And again, this whole live right now is being very technical, I know, but I want to try and make it as simple as possible for as many people to follow along. So the ADU on the second floor, as we discussed, is going to be the primary ADU on paper, right? This is the unit that's going to be legalized as the fourth unit on this lot. So you go up the stairs, you have a comfortable 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom layout, and the whole square footage of this area is going to be 800 square feet. So that's my rule of thumb. If you guys don't know too much, 500 square feet is comfortable for 1-bedrooms, 800 is comfortable for 2-bedrooms, and luckily enough, we were able to fit in a second bathroom here. So we had the master bedroom with master ensuite and a closet, and then a normal bedroom with a 3-piece bathroom on the outside. So it doesn't seem too cramped in, but it's got enough room for all these rooms in this space. And then we're going to go with the elevations, which again, and this is just my train of thought here, it's like we're not trying to overcomplicate the exterior. We're not trying to make it overly designed-wise, like all the trim work too much, just because we're going to put most of our budget, or the idea is to put most of the budget into the interior finishes. So we're trying to make this simple as possible. Wood siding, slab on grade, simple gable roof as much as possible, right? You don't have to be overly creative into the exterior if you don't have to be. So simple slab on grade with 4-foot footings if we need to. Right, we have some of the structural drawings, but that's a little bit too technical for this video. Right. So now that we talked a little bit about the project, again, it's not too overly complicated, but what I really want to let people know is more the bylaws and information there, just because a lot of people are getting confused on that. So keep in mind, a lot of cities will have new bylaws and old bylaws. So when you really look into the zoning, you have to be sure which bylaws you're working with. For example, I went to Guelph today, and they have two bylaws, simultaneously working with each other. So what they're saying is when you're working with the new and the old, you have to use them both, and whichever is the more restrictive is what you have to go with. So at this period of time, at least in Guelph, if you're submitting for a permit, you're going to be using both bylaws. And where's the most restrictive, that's where you're going to be using for your drawings, your application, and anything you're going to be using, for any submissions. So keep that in mind. In Hamilton, they do have two bylaws, the old and the new, and they are slowly transitioning the old bylaws, it's the older formal bylaws, there's a bunch of them, converting to the new bylaws, the 05200 series. That's still in the works, but right now, at least luckily for us, they're not mix and matching them. So at least for the older bylaws, which we're going to open up right now, if I can find them here, depending on your area, on your zone, if you fall under specific zones here, like for example, if you fall under the B1, B2, C, R4, D, or R2 district, you are able to do up to 4 units, and they do allow a secondary dwelling unit detached. This is what I mean about different verbiage with different cities. Because Toronto will say garden suite or laneway house. Hamilton has different definitions, but they all mean the same thing, really. So this is where it gets tricky, because now your representative, your building permit expert who you're retaining for that project, has to understand what the regulations are for that specific zone. Because the new and the old have completely different things. Some of them are similar, but some are a little bit different. For example, in the older bylaws of Hamilton, the secondary unit detached can only have a maximum of 2 bedrooms, which isn't too much of a big problem when you have like an 800 square foot unit maximum. But if you're allowed to have a bigger garden suite, then you would want to have that 3rd bedroom if you really wanted to. Right. Again, I'm not trying to get too technical here. We're going to run through this a little bit. I'm just going to go into the high level points that I think are important for your garden suite, right? So, of course, we had the setback requirements, which, again, it's fairly simple and straightforward. The rule of thumb is I always put in 4 feet between like the sides lot lines and the rear lot lines. The most important one is, of course, the front of the ADU, the garden suite, to the rear side of the existing household. That's the important part, right? There has to be a minimum distance there. And of course, there has to be a path of travel from the garden suite to the sidewalk on the exterior side, right? This is where it gets a little bit complicated, because we've had projects where they don't have a sidewalk. They have a driveway going from the street road all the way through until they've hit the backyard, right? So now it gets a bit complicated, because now do you count the 1 meter requirement as part of the driveway, or do you have to add 1 more meter to the driveway? This is where interpretation plays along. Which, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar, some cities have their own sort of interpretation list. So if you're really struggling with the zoning bylaws and you're at like, a 50-50, what if, different interpretation, so you can go to city zoning staff and they would have a list of the zoning information there to let you know exactly like how they would interpret this bylaw based on their experience. Right? Because they understand too, the interpretation can kind of go one way or another, but they have a set rule on like how they would interpret it from their own systems. So this is what I'm talking about. So this part right here where I'm highlighting, this is the minimum distance. 7.5 meters, right? This is where it gets tricky, because if you have an existing garage and you want to convert that into a garden suite, if that existing garage is below that minimum of 7.5 meters, this is where you might have to go through committee of adjustments, minor variance to get that approved, right? There are some cities that don't really mind it, because in an existing condition, you really can't control that. So as long as you're not building new walls, they'll let you keep the existing garage as is and kind of grandfather that in. For corner lots, yeah, this is where it gets a little bit tricky too, because now you're working with an exterior side yard and you're working with the lot lines on that side being a little bit greater. Sometimes, okay. So again, different cities have different requirements. So the general rule of thumb is usually 3 meters setback from the exterior side yard. So on the interior side between your neighbors is 1.2, which is like 4 feet. Then on the other side where you're facing another street, it's about 3 meters from the lot line. Remember, it's not from the sidewalk, it's not from your fence, it's from wherever your lot line is, which could be at your fence. We don't know until you get the legal land survey. But at that property line, then it's 3 meters away from it. So generally, it's the same rule of thumb except for that setback there. Then we have here the maximum of 6 meters in height. That's the important part because there are some cities that have 6 meters in height and then 4.5 meters in height. Which, when you do the math in like Imperial, 6 meters is about 19 feet, which you can try to get away with, 2 stories if you can, right? Or some of the investors I've been speaking to, they want at least 1 story plus like a mezzanine area or a loft area for the bedroom on that part. 4.5 meters isn't going to get you. It's like what, 14 feet, give or take, if I remember correctly. It's not really going to get you that second story that you want. So now you have to work with the existing conditions there and keep 1 story. So it limits you. So it definitely makes a big difference there if you were looking to do 2 story addition there, a second story addition, right? But again, keep in mind when we are doing a second story addition, that second story has to meet new building code, has to meet the new bylaws of today. So in the past, what's happened before, it's like we can build a second story addition and keep it flush with the existing building footprint. So for example, if you had an existing garage 20 by 20, right? Your second story can actually be the same sort of footprint. Now the city has kind of rejected the idea completely and telling us your new second story has to meet today's zoning bylaws, which if you can kind of picture it, and we'll show you an example here actually for the Toronto example, we have an existing garage and the second story is going to be like, what was it? Like 3/4 of the actual footprint. So we're basically making a smaller box on top of the original box. So it doesn't work out well in terms of layouts and designs and even appearances. It looks terrible, right? But those are zoning bylaws there for the new second story addition. So if you're really going to go that route, keep in mind you're most likely going to have to go for minor variance committee of adjustments. Okay. And this is where, so this is the main kicker here. The gross floor area. I mentioned before 800 square feet was kind of like the average or the typical one. And this is where the zoning code was telling us, 75 square meters, which converted is about 800 square feet. But there are some areas here, like this part shall not exceed 70% of the ground floor area of the principal dwelling. So for example, like if we take a normal household, like whatever household you can think of, right? And the gross floor area for that household, first and second is 2,000, but your ground floor is only 1,000. Then your garden suite cannot exceed that 1,000 square footage, right? If it's over 105 square meters. So there's a little bit of math into that. It all depends on your existing conditions there. But ideally, yeah, they don't want you to go bigger than the ground floor area, at least in this Hamilton older zoning bylaw, right? Again, a lot of the older stuff in Hamilton is being shifted into the new 05200. So just keep that in mind. This is what really kind of like some designers miss. So this is why I want to kind of highlight as important, right? You have to really understand what they mean about gross floor area. And this is where we kind of got to the last project I was talking about, where we made use of that gross floor area definition and just used it for the second floor instead of the main floor. And then lastly, landscaping, which majority of the time you're able to kind of maintain the minimum landscaping requirements. It's never really been too much of a problem, at least with our projects. But again, different lots, different sizes, we might end up into a situation where we have to kind of adjust that a little bit. Okay, so that was the older bylaws there. Now we're going to take a quick look at the newer bylaws. So this, I'm just going to save. And again, if you guys are interested at looking at some of these bylaw notes and such, and want some of my markups, you guys are more than free to kind of DM me for those, at least for your own reference. 05200. Okay, here we go. Here's the new zoning bylaws for ADUs in Hamilton. So, of course, if you're in any of these zones here, yeah, so these are new zones, yeah. D5, I1, I2, C1, TOC3, R1, R1A zone, which I'm pretty sure a lot of designers are familiar with R1, R1A zone, right? That was part of the August 2022 revisions. Of course, they mentioned maximum 1 ADU, which again, additional dwelling unit detached is the same thing as like garden suite in a way. I've already highlighted a couple points here, which is like, the rear side setbacks, the minimum requirements there, right? A lot of them are pretty similar to the old one: 7.5 meters, 1 meter of the path, 6 meters in height. They added a little bit here about the balconies and rooftops, which again, I don't think a lot of investors are willing to go that far into that investment. It's a little bit more work, but if you are interested, just know it's not really allowed above the first floor. And again, the 75 square meter requirement there. So a lot of it's fairly the same. It just depends on the area that you're in Hamilton, right? Yeah, so even this one, set back to a minimum of 5 meters from the front face of the principal dwelling. Yeah. There's different requirements here. Okay, so we're going to go into one more example in the in the Hamilton area, right? As an example, like your typical 800 square foot, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathroom layout. If you're building brand new, this is typically the rule of thumb here that we're using, at least in my team. 2 bedrooms on side by side, walk-in closets on each side, 2 bathrooms, and the center area would be for the living, dining, kitchen, with a service room in the corner, along with the laundry room on the other side here. So it seems a little bit tight, but at least for 800 square feet, we're able to get all the required room areas that an investor would want, right? And this is 1 story, by the way. Now, at least with this project, I'll let you know that the existing building that we're working on this project for is only 600, no, what was it? I think it was 870 square feet. So based on the bylaws, they're telling us we can't go over 70% of that. So when you do the math, it's like the maximum we can go was this brand new garden suite is 630, I believe. So we can't really take this typical design and use it because this is for 800 square feet, and the maximum we can do is only 630. So we either have to kind of redesign this completely or kind of cut off just this whole portion here to kind of only keep the 1 bedroom, 1 bath layout for the garden suite. Now, you can be very creative when you're doing a lot of these garden suites. So one idea I mentioned to the owners at this point is do the slab on grade for the entire 800 square feet and then build a 600 square feet garden suite above that. So you're going to be keeping a lot of this area here. This would all be like a concrete slab, at least until we can get approvals to make that addition to the garden suite. Because the one way you can only get past this sort of bylaw here is by doing a house addition to the existing building to make that ground floor a lot bigger, so then the math makes sense. So if we made that ground floor area 200 square feet bigger, then we would be able to have that 800 square foot maximum here, right? But again, it's a lot more money for that sort of addition if you can just get away with either the 600 square foot 1 bedroom or trying to plan this out for the future. Again, future proofing is kind of the best way we're going about this. And then again, very simple design. It's not overly complicated. Wood siding, slab on grade, gable roof. Again, you don't have to be overcomplicated with these garden suites, at least for the investor side. I know a lot of the bigger companies that do these projects at a high luxury level have gone more detailed. But again, our clientele is more investors, so we have to make things as simple as possible. Okay, so again, remember guys, if you have any questions, you can always add them to the chat there. I'll give you guys a minute to see if you guys have any questions and before we move on to the Toronto side. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Toronto projects here, right? So this is a recent permit we got maybe, I don't know, what was it? A few months ago, back in December 2023. So we had an existing concrete block empty garage on the backside of this property, abutting a laneway. So at least in Toronto, and again, we're going to go a little bit of high-level information here. Toronto has 2 definitions for these types of buildings: laneway and garden suite. Obviously, if you kind of understand that, laneway houses are against the laneway and garden suites are not. That's pretty much the gist of the definition there. And they do have 2 different bylaws for it. But once you read through it, there's relatively the same thing. They just have two ways to kind of define these types of buildings, right? But for this one, it is a laneway conversion. So garage to laneway house. And square footage is about 445. And we're keeping it at 1 story, right? A lot of times we are trying to keep these existing garages the same building show. Rarely we would have to kind of demolish a roof and build a new one if we have to, or if that roof is severely damaged. Majority of the time we are demolishing the entire concrete slab. So if you're going on site, you'll see sometimes the existing slab is kind of like old and bumpy and it's not really flat. Don't worry about it, because majority of the time you're going to be demolishing it all to kind of put in the new plumbing work, the new sewer work. So it's like we're going to be changing it completely. It's not really a big factor in it. Okay. Okay, so this is the 1 story laneway house. And again, okay, so before I move on more to the building side, the zoning information here, I would highly recommend going through the zoning review, compliance review, I believe they call it, application, right? Before you even start any of the engineering drawings, make sure that the zoning isn't stopping you for whatever reason. God forbid you didn't understand the zoning correctly and you're already at engineering phase, you pay the engineers, you work with engineers, you're almost at building permit phase, you submit it, and the city stops you right at zoning, because zoning will be the first thing they review, right? So, and if the zoning doesn't work, they'll make you go through committee of adjustments or redesign your entire layout. And if you're redesigning everything, your engineers are redesigning everything as well. So it kind of delays everything, and then the engineers will obviously have revision costs to that too. So make sure the zoning is properly done from the first get-go, and we usually go through the zoning compliance review, at least for us, to make sure it's 100% done. It does add at least 3 weeks to your whole timeline there, but I'd rather be safe than sorry at the long run. At least, especially when you're trying to take care of your investor, you're making sure everything's properly done. So with this one, we went through the zoning compliance review. It's really just the site plan, the elevations, the floor plans, explain to them how it's going to look out. Again, they're not looking at building code stuff. Your design for that garden suite can be a little bit different in the final draft. They're just making sure that you're following everything into the zoning bylaws. Even for us, to be 100% sure, we made sure to reference a lot of the zoning bylaws from Toronto's, zoning bylaw booklet, right? Everything is referenced to something, right? So, zoning there, we're going to get into a little bit of the building. Because again, a lot of times, a lot of people can't visualize the new build. So this is the existing garage, which is a little bit awkward because the main door to the garage is facing the house, rear side, and the actual garage door is on the laneway side. So a little bit different than normal, but it is what it is there. We had 443 square feet, and then we converted into a 1-bedroom unit here, right? So a lot of things to consider. Number one, biggest issue is always the garage door. So a lot of people can visualize this, but you're going to be removing the garage door and replacing it with like a new insulated wall. And for us, at least, we're replacing the garage door with like a new double door barn kind of type of door. It's not really going to be used to open anything. It's just there for decorations, right? But beyond that barn door is going to be an insulated wall assembly here, right? So we are making sure this entire garage is insulated properly, because originally it's not. It's an existing concrete block wall. So 1-bedroom unit here, 400 square feet. It's a good size. I usually go by 500 square foot per 1-bedroom, but this still works. Still meets all the building code requirements there. The one thing you guys have to keep in mind of when you're doing these conversions is, of course, the service room. Depending on how you're planning to service the building, from like the HVAC and the plumbing, right? Your service room could be a lot bigger or smaller, right? If you're going all heat pumps, right, I don't think you're going to need that big of a service room. But if you're going with a furnace, your service room might need to be a lot bigger. From my understanding, from a lot of other designers, like designs as well that I've been speaking to, we kind of decided about like 5x5 service room if you're doing a furnace and traditional hot water tank with the HRV system there. So again, it depends on the layout there, but 5x5 is usually our safe spot. In this case, we were using heat pumps, and we had to put the HRV system for, again, the air exchange and the traditional hot water tank, right? Again, I'm going a little technical here, but I'm just making sure you guys are taken care of and making sure you guys are, making sure your building or your drawings or your application at least has these in mind, right? And the same thing with other conversion projects. If you guys are familiar with it, window requirements, you need to have laundry, you need to have minimum ceiling height requirements, you need to have minimum room size requirements, because that's the tricky part. Depending on how much bedrooms you're going to be adding to the unit itself, changes the minimum room size requirements, right? So keep that in mind when you are designing it. 1 bedroom to 2 bedroom is definitely going to affect the minimum requirements for the living, dining, kitchen space. The bathroom doesn't really have a minimum room size. It's not really there. But again, you want to make it comfortable enough and meet standard. Like the 5x7 size is the most typical or standard size, at least in the industry. Okay. Again, we didn't do anything too much to the exterior side. Keeping the garage the way it looks like. Roof was going to stay the same thing as well. Nothing really overly complicated. Again, building section, we're showing them we're replacing the slab with a new one, insulating the walls and ceiling, making it as simple as possible, and assumptions, because this is where it gets tricky with some cities. Of course, unless you dig the hole beside the garden suite and dig down to see what type of footing it is or how deep the footing goes, you're not going to know what it is. So what we recommend some investors and even designers do is try to work together with a contractor or structural engineer, have them dig down at least one hole beside the existing garage, maybe a 2x2 hole, as far down as they can go to see what it is. Is it really slab on grade, or is it like a foot in at 4 feet deep, right? And this is what the city wants to understand too. In our case, we try and make assumptions here, right, to be determined by the GCs on site when they actually start the project, right? So you can go one or two ways, but at least for us, in my experience, when I assumed slab on grade, the city rejected that and would only accept this permit if we assume it was 4 feet deep foundation. So keep that in mind. Some cities are a little bit more nitpicky than others. And yeah, keeping it simple there. So we'll go through the little bit of the bylaws here just for you guys to understand a little bit. So garden suites, it's on 150.7 of the Toronto zoning bylaws there, right? Setbacks. And again, this is where your existing building is fine the way it is. No matter how close or how off the setbacks are, it's fine. It's only when you do this more additions to it. So if you were, let's say, tearing down one of the walls of the existing garage and trying to make the garage wider, that new wall would have to meet today's zoning setbacks. So it's almost not worth doing that unless you're going to get a significant increase in size. So I just recommend just keeping the existing garage the way it is to save on cost and any sort of zoning issues. So we have the setback requirements depending on the lot sizes, right? Again, and this is where Toronto gets a little bit overly complicated. The lot's size setback does depend if you have doors or windows on the side of that building. And it can go from 1.5 meters all the way to like 3 meters. So this is where, and again, I say overly complicated because now you have to kind of go back to your drawings and see, do you really need a window on this wall? If so, then you're going to affect your setback. But then again, your existing building isn't affected by that. So it's a really back and forth game there. We're going to get into a little bit of the separation requirements and angular planes a little bit, just because one of our projects, again, falls under that. And what I mean by that is this example here, you'll see a 3D image of that building we have. So it's an existing one-story garage that we were planning to do a second-story addition above it. But the problem is this face of the wall here on the second floor cannot be flush with the existing footprint. It has to be pushed back. It's got to be somewhere here, because this wall, this ground floor wall, is too close to the existing building. This front wall is maybe 3 meters from the existing building rear side. So because of that, this existing one-story area is fine, but the second story has to be pushed back 4 more meters. So it really screws up the design there and the layout. And at that point, it's not worth it unless we go through committee of adjustment, which again, it takes more time, more money, more effort. So it really depends on your investor's risk tolerance if they want to go through that route, especially if you're planning to be the planner or at least a representative against the committee of adjustment members. That's another different story there, but I always recommend trying to work as a planner. They understand the city's language. They understand where they're coming from. They can definitely put up a good fight for you, especially when I kind of compare that to lawyers. You don't go to court by yourself. You bring a lawyer there. So that's where we would bring the planners along. But back to the whole zoning bylaws here, at least in Toronto, they also have an angular planes. So what they mean by that is at a certain height, like 4 feet high, 4 meters high, your building wall has to kind of angle 45 degrees on all sides. So you can imagine that complication there isn't really going to work well for a second story garage addition, especially if they all have to be 45-degree angles. It's going to make the second floor severely so much smaller. It's going to make it so tiny it's not going to make sense. Again, this is just because this particular this garage is so close to the existing building and the backyard isn't as great as the first example I showed you guys in Hamilton, right? So again, it's a case by case study, and it's always good to like pick other people's brain about like, what do you think about this? Does this work? And again, heights depends. The height of the garden suite does depend for existing buildings on how far it is from the household. So unlike Hamilton, where it says you need 7.5 meters, which is fine, but they don't care. They only tell you the height regardless. Toronto says your height is dependent on how far it is from the existing building. So rule of thumb is, at least with Toronto garden suites, is like the farther back your existing garage is from your main household, the higher you can build it up. So that's the rule of thumb there. If it's so close to your existing household, you're going to be limited on height, which again, you can imagine a lot of these garages weren't built to be that far away from the household. They were built to be pretty close. So we're going to be restricted majority of the time. Maximum story is 2, which is pretty average. We're never really going to go 3. I know a lot of designers are a little bit confused about the floor space index, which really isn't included into the garden suite, so you don't have to be worried too much about that. Lot coverage is the trickiest part because technically you can't go over 60 square meters, which is like, again, 645 square feet. It's not the 800 square feet that we want, but it depends on the frontage, I believe. What was this area? Yeah. The area, covered may not exceed 40% of the area. Yeah. Sorry, it's not the frontage, it's the area itself. So, and you'll see this a lot of times with the zoning bylaws if you're really looking into it. They will have, this or that, whichever is lesser. So, whatever is the most restrictive part of these zoning bylaws, you have to design assuming that, right? You can't go with like the best case scenario. You have to go with the worst case scenario, which is what we always do, which, it's not the best way to go about that, I would say, but at least it protects us on all fronts. Next, parking, right? You don't really need a parking for a garden suite. You can replace it with bicycle spaces. So it's not overly complicated, which some people would assume. It's really just letting the city know you're going to have 2 dedicated bicycle spaces on the lot, right? So you have to make sure that it's within, I believe, a sort of it's an area within the garden suite. So beside your front door of the garden suite, it could be there. We usually put in like a 5-rack bicycle space, one of those typical 5-rack ones that we just put there. I think minimum was 2. Yeah, minimum was 2, but you can put in 5 just in case. But yeah, that's pretty much the garden suite stuff there in Toronto. They do have a little bit of a cheat sheet on their website if you can look for it. I did find it before, and if I find it, I'll post it here on Discord. But it's a more simplified version of this document here, which kind of helps investors understand the requirements. But this is more for the designers and trying to understand like what's really required for the garden suites. So let's go back to the example here. No, not going to save here. That's fine. Yeah, so for this design, we're going for committed adjustments. We're going to be requesting this footprint here. And again, this design, 1-story existing garage. The main floor is going to be living, dining, kitchen, and the second floor is planned to be 2-bedroom area. Right, even though the size of the existing garage is 500, what was it? No, that's the main household. The existing garage was about 464. fairly similar to the other garden suite or laneway house we had before. So we could have gone away with one bedroom, but again, depending on the investors, they would want to have more bedrooms if possible, right? 2 bedroom rental is a lot different than 1 bedroom rental. So if you can get 2 bedrooms, perfect. If you can't, we may have to look for some alternatives, right? Which again, an alternative for this one was trying to demolish the roof, build a higher pitch roof, and put like a loft area in this 1 story garage. That way we can have the second bedroom in this loft area and have the 1 bedroom on the ground floor level. So we get what the investor gets what they want to get 2 bedrooms instead of doing the whole second story addition. The problem is when we spoke to the examiner about this, he was not too pleased about that interpretation because the new roof is technically going over today's setbacks. So they wouldn't approve that. He would make us go through committee of adjustments to get that approved. So one way or another, we would still have to go through committee of adjustments. But it's always trying to be creative with these designs, right? Again, you have to read through the bylaws, understand exactly how their definition works, and try to see what would work out well for your investors, while also trying to make sure it meets building code, right? So all of these pieces kind of working together to kind of get you the best design at the best budget possible, right? So yeah, second story addition, that was the idea here. And the second story addition was going to make this garden suite to be as big, if not bigger, than the existing main household. So it's going to be a tough, thing to sell, at least in my point of view, to kind of tell the city we are making a house just as big or if not bigger than the original household. Again, the idea with these garden suites, they should be the same size. Sorry, they should be smaller than the original household, right? But again, you can make your case and see what they say about it. Okay. So that's pretty much what I have to say with Toronto and Hamilton. And again, a lot of these documents, I will try to upload it on Discord somehow. But in the meantime, if you guys have any questions, I'm more than open to it. Again, tonight was just more the technical side of it. I know it can get somewhat boring, but just trying to educate people as much as possible and understanding why the designers can't do a certain method or way versus, if it sounds simpler on paper, right? Yeah, so let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll give you guys another minute or so. But if not, then we can kind of wrap this up. And yeah, you guys can always feel free to DM me afterwards if you have a specific question or you're looking at a property, or even for other designers in the room who are looking to get a second opinion on the zoning bylaws interpretation or design advice there. We can definitely kind of work together on that to see how that works. Because I know a lot of these bylaws are a little bit tricky to work with. Okay. Okay. So we'll leave it like that tonight. If you guys have any questions, again, feel free to reach out. But yeah, we'll leave it there. And appreciate you guys coming on live with me. All right. Perfect. All right. Not a problem, Taco. We'll leave it at that. And yeah. All right. Take care, guys. Have a good night.